Welcome to Dogs in the Workplace, Benefits and Potential Challenges. We're glad you're here. My name is Angie Hunt, Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, formerly known as the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or on the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You'll be emailed direct links for all of these items when they are available. As I mentioned, my name is Angie, and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenter today is Ann Foreman. Ann Foreman is a behavioral scientist in the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in Morgantown, West Virginia. She earned a PhD in psychology from West Virginia University. She has conducted research on the effects of service dogs on workplace stress among veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder and the perceptions of the health and safety risks of therapy dogs in the workplace. And her other research interests include decision-making, behavioral economics, and observational learning. And now I'll hand it over to Ann.
Hi, well, thank you all for joining me today. I'm happy to give this talk and give you some more information about dogs in the workplace and the benefits and potential challenges that accompany those. I have to put a disclaimer on my slide that the findings and conclusions in this presentation are mine and do not necessarily represent the official position of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which is a part of Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. So to start, why would a dog be in the workplace? So dogs can play many different roles in the workplace environment as assistance animals, as public service or military animals, or in what's becoming more and more common, which are pet-friendly workplaces. So I'm going to go over each of these definitions to start. So assistance animals, and these definitions come from a taxonomy that my group and I published a couple years ago on the terminology to use when we talk about different types of assistance animals, because it can be very confusing and people use different terms all the time. So I'm gonna define the terms that I'm gonna use, and those align with the paper. And I'll put that in the bibliography with the slides that are published on the website. So to start, service animals are dogs typically that are trained to provide work or perform tasks related to an individual's disability. Now I say dog because in the United States, the law protects dogs as service animals. You can't have a service cat or service pig or anything else. You used to be able to, but as of 2010, only dogs. There are extra protections in the law for miniature horses. The laws in Canada are different than the United States, obviously. I think that it goes generally more province to province. I'm less educated about the Canadian laws, but I'm pretty sure it's very similar to the United States, whereas most of the time it's usually just dogs that are permitted as service animals. But they're often performing tasks for people with physical disabilities or psychiatric disabilities. So you can see in the world, you can see hearing dogs, guiding dogs, mobility dogs. And for psychiatric disabilities, I worked with and trained a dog for veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders. You see autism spectrum disorder dogs becoming more frequent. So those are service animals, and they have public access. But in the workplace, they function as a reasonable accommodation. And I'm not going to go over the legal aspects of this because there's so much difference potentially across countries. But look into your local laws and your federal laws to see where those what the regulations are where you are. For visitation animals, these are often called therapy animals in the popular parlance, but we call them visitation animals because it's more specific about what they do. And these are dogs that are trained in basic skills to provide comfort and support through companionship and social interaction. So these are dogs that are often seen in nursing homes or in libraries. A lot of libraries will have programs where kids can come in and read to dogs, and the dogs enjoy it and the kids enjoy it, and it can help potentially with literacy. There's probably limited literature on that, but you could see how that could possibly possibly be the case. And they have limited public access. And there are lots of organizations that certify them. Some of these are international. So, for example, Therapy Dogs International, and I believe Pet Partners is as well. And so people can get their dogs trained and take them to these facilities. Another type of assistance animal is a therapy animal, and the way we define it is that a therapy animal works with someone to help treat people. So they're trained in basic or advanced skills to assist healthcare or allied healthcare professionals within the scope of their therapeutic treatment plan. So for example, a physical therapist may have a dog that they have in their practice that helps them treat people. So that, for example, a physical therapy dog may help a child who has, limited mobility, but they're improving his mobility. They might have the child throw a toy to a dog to have them fetch the toy and have them work on those motor skills. Same with occupational therapy. You may see an occupational therapist who has a therapy dog that helps them in their practice. So the client may brush the dog, they may groom the dog, they may do different things with the dog to work on their fine motor skills. And in psychotherapy, you may have a dog there to help facilitate the patient-therapist relationship, or to serve as an icebreaker, or to help a child psychologist, for example, because a child may be more comfortable communicating with the dog in some cases. So you can see therapy animals in all of these, and they also have limited public access. And a support animal, they provide physical, psychiatric, or emotional support primarily in the home, and they have very limited public access. Now, in the US, we have a weird thing where you can take a support animal on a plane with a note from a doctor. That may not be weird, but it can create weird news stories where you see where someone takes their, I saw a recent story where someone took their emotional support pig on a plane, and the pig had to be removed because I think it threw a fit or something, and they had to remove the dog or the pig. But in general, they have limited public access. Now, in the workplace in the US, the workplace laws do not define what a service animal is. So theoretically, an employee could take their support animal to work with them as a reasonable accommodation. So it is something, it's not just a service dog. It could be a support animal a support dog that goes into the workplace with them. And you can also see capuchin monkeys were were service animals for a while until 2010, but now they're limited to the home environment. But there are organizations, now, I don't think there are very many, they do train capuchin monkeys as support animals. So here's a table that comes from our taxonomy paper, just as an overview of what we just talked about. And I didn't mention public service or military animals specifically because those are like bomb sniffing dogs and other types of dogs that are found in the workplace that have public access related to their tasks. But I'll provide this reference in the slides that are posted. So why would these dogs be in the workplace? So a service dog or a support dog may be there as a reasonable accommodation for a disability. A therapy dog might be there helping an employee with intervention. So if you work in a physical therapy clinic or an occupational therapy clinic or one of those, there might be a therapy dog there. A visitation animal might be there for employees or for clients. So if you work in a hospital, there might be visitation animals that come to visit, and those aren't necessarily just dogs. People do have a lot of the therapy animal organizations will also certify cats, because depending on the client, there are dog people in the world and there are cat people in the world. So if you go, for example, to a nursing home, some of the patients there may be much more amenable to interacting with a cat than they are a dog. So in those cases, you can see the need for some flexibility. And then pets. This is something I'm going to talk about in these slides, because there's a lot more leeway with pets and with what you can regulate around pets, because they don't have legal protections. So if you want to allow pets into your workplace, you need to take into a lot of things into consideration that you can't necessarily if you're accommodating a disability. And then also mascots. So for example, we have a local fire department here that has a Dalmatian. So they can serve to attract attention and good PR for the organization. So in terms of therapeutic effect, one of the reasons that a lot of people like therapy animals or like pet-friendly workplaces is that the benefits that it can bring to the employees in the workplace. And there are several theories that are being tested for this. One is a social catalyst. So Levinson was a psychotherapist, and he's first published in the 60s, a paper on a dog as a co-therapist. So he talked about his dog being an icebreaker and helping him develop relationships, therapeutic relationships with his clients who were children. Attachment and social support is another hypothesis. So there's potentially a role of oxytocin, which is called the love hormone. So there's some studies that have shown that, gazing at your dog, making eye contact with your dog increases the amount of oxytocin, and those kinds of, that increase in hormone can improve your functioning in certain respects. A lot of these things are understudied, and a lot of these are still hypotheses. Another potential explanation for the therapeutic effect is distraction. So a dog may distract you from a stressful situation. So if you have a dog there you can pet, it might make a situation, a stressful phone call might be a little less stressful if you have a dog there to pet. Or if you're in a social situation that you may find awkward, or if you have some social anxiety, a dog might provide a little distraction in those cases. So these are all very plausible reasons for why dogs can be therapeutic. The evidence for therapeutic effect, you may have seen just a recent study that came out of Sweden. It's actually a pretty well done study because it looked over 12 years and spanned 3.4 million people and found a correlation between dog owners. Dog owners had a lower rate of cardiovascular disease and a lower risk of death than people who did not own dogs. And so that's a pretty well done study. There's a lot of studies out there that are not well done, so it's important to be able to identify ones that are well done. There have been laboratory studies that show acute decreases in stress in the presence of a dog. So for example, these are laboratory studies where the subject comes in and sits down, and they either have a dog with them or they don't, and they have to do some kind of stressful task. And in laboratory studies, these are typically things like counting backwards by a certain number. So you have to count back by 7, and you need to do it at this pace, and you need to do it right now and say it out loud, and that can be stressful. And they find that when you have a dog there, your stress responses are less than when the dog is absent. Another way they do this is where they have you give a presentation. So you come into the laboratory and they say, okay, you have 5 minutes to prepare. You have to give a presentation on Marxism, and you're going to give it in front of this panel of judges, and all the judges are like wearing white coats to make you feel more intimidated. And they have you do that. I think it's called the trier-social stress test, and they've done studies with this in the presence and absence of a dog, and when the dog is there, you have less of a stress response in terms of heart rate and blood pressure than when the dog isn't there. They've done studies on social facilitation, so you have more friendly social interactions in the presence of a dog. And the way they've done these studies is they put a person out in public with a dog, and they keep track of who talks to them. And sometimes the person is in a wheelchair, and they found that people, because that can be sometimes people are less inclined to approach someone in a wheelchair for whatever reason, but they find with a dog present, people are more likely to engage with the person and with the dog. And same with and they've looked at it with different breeds of dogs and different things, and found that puppies facilitate more social interactions than a more aggressive looking dog would. But in general, they find that dogs improve social or increase social interactions. And anyone who owns a dog and has walked it probably understands this. And there have not been very many studies done in the workplace. So this is where there should be more research done. But in studies that have been done, a couple studies have shown that employees that bring their dogs to work have had lower perceived stress throughout the day than those who did not bring their dogs to work. But again, this is a very limited area so far, so we don't have a lot to draw on in terms of the evidence base. There's a lot of potential, but we can't say anything definitively, that's for sure. And there are a lot of methodological weaknesses in the literature that I am obligated to point out. And there have been several good papers out recently that have talked about these weaknesses, especially in terms of papers that look at animal-assisted interventions, which are when you take dogs or other animals to, let's say, a nursing home and look at the effect of interactions on things like depression and anxiety and social behavior. And so there are these methodological weaknesses like absence of control groups or sufficient control groups, non-blinded observers, small sample sizes, and often they don't look at the effects long term. So there's a recent paper by Alan Kasdan in Applied Developmental Science, and it's a really great paper, and I'll make sure to include that in the bibliography. But better research needs to be done to really to really figure out what are the real effects of dogs. We all know anecdotally that they can be very beneficial, but the science isn't there yet. So I have to point that out. The potential is, when we talk about potential benefits, especially in a work environment, it has the potential to improve morale. It has the potential to increase social interactions among people. And I've included these pictures from different workplaces that have dogs. And the one in the lower right is, I really want to work there. It looks like a fun place. I think it's at some kind of dog food or animal company, so it makes sense, but it looks like a really fun place to work. And potentially improve productivity. You could also see how it could potentially be a distraction, but it may improve productivity, and maybe it would decrease absenteeism or improve attendance. But these are all, potential questions that could be answered by science. So now we're going to talk about hazards. So, it seems like a great idea to let's let dogs come to the workplace. Well, what are the potential problems that we could run into with that? And of course, dogs bring with them some potential hazards, and we're going to talk about some of these. Allergies. So 1.6% of the US population is allergic to dogs, and 15 to 30% of people with allergies have reactions to dogs and cats. And I didn't include the citations on the slides because it clutters them up a lot, but on the slides that go on the website, they'll have the citations on them. CanF1 is an allergen in hair, dander, and saliva. And when they've studied allergens in public settings, 40% of upholstered furniture had significant levels of CanF1. So even if you don't have a dog, you're around dog dander all the time. Same with cats, but I didn't include them in this set of slides because this is about dogs. But cats are up there too. And actually, cat dander is a lot stickier than dog allergen, so it can be more problematic. And they did a study where they actually looked at people's houses with non-dog owners and dog owners, and they found that there were amounts in people's houses who didn't have dogs. There were amounts of dog dander that could trigger asthma symptoms. And these are houses where dogs have never been present, potentially. And there's also no such thing as a hypoallergenic dog. This is it's possible that they're lower hypoallergenic dogs, but in a study was done that compared homes with hypoallergenic dogs versus regular dogs, and the differences in the amount of the allergen were not statistically significant, so they were functionally equivalent. And so, dogs that we typically consider to be hypoallergenic, like a Chinese crested that is hairless for most of its body, is still an allergenic dog because the allergen is not just on the hair, but it's also in the saliva. So a lot of times people are reacting to the allergen in the saliva. So there may be dogs that vary in terms of the amount of allergen, but there's not good evidence that hypoallergenic dogs exist. So how can you deal with allergies, especially in a workplace environment? HEPA filters have been shown to be effective in reducing dog allergen. So and they can be found pretty inexpensively nowadays on Amazon and other places, and they are effective. HEPA vacuums are more effective for cat allergen, but they do work for some amount of dog allergen. And they've found that double bags are the most effective in terms of sucking up the allergen and keeping it in the vacuum. Dog bathing has also been shown to decrease the amount of allergen. So washing twice a week significantly reduces the amount of allergen in the hair and dander samples, which you would not want to. It would not be reasonable potentially to ask someone with a dog that they're using as an accommodation for their disability to bathe their dog twice a week, but this may be a reasonable thing to ask people who are bringing their pets to work if you have someone in the workplace who has an allergy. Same with, you might want to buy potentially depending a HEPA filter for the person's work environment if they have allergies. So keep this by your desk and it will help improve the air quality in your environment. Zoonotic diseases, in general, dogs pose minimal risks to humans, but they do pose a greater risk to people who are immunosuppressed, whether that's due to receiving chemotherapy or radiation therapy, elderly people and children, and people who have received organ or bone marrow transplants, and pregnant women. In general, though, it's a minimal risk, but I'll mention a few of the zoonotic diseases that are more common in dogs. Campylobacteriosis is the leading cause of gastroenteritis in industrialized countries. And there's some research suggesting that 8% of the cases may be due to contact with dogs and cats. And to prevent this, it's proper handling of of pet feces, making sure that you're washing your hands after you clean up after a dog. Tapeworm, hookworm, and roundworm are intestinal parasites, and it's more common for children to get these because they're more likely to be interacting with pet feces, but it's still a risk, and prevention, again, is proper handling of pet feces. Ringworm is a fungus, which dogs can pass on to humans. Rabies, obviously, is, I mean, most people have heard of rabies, and Lyme disease, which comes, the dog wouldn't give you Lyme disease, but a tick that a dog is carrying could give you Lyme disease. So that's another hazard the dogs present. And to prevent these is essentially, for a lot of these, it's hand washing and vaccines. So make sure that, and I'm going to mention this later, but if you're allowing pets in a workplace environment, make sure that you're making your employees keep them vaccinated. And again, this is for pet-friendly workplaces or, therapy dog program or therapy visitation dogs, ensuring that the employees are making sure they're vaccinated, making sure that they're not coming to work with rashes or hot spots that could be ringworm or something similar, making sure that they're on some kind of flea or tick preventative, and then again, washing your hands. Slips, trips, and falls are something that that dogs can potentially present. The dog itself can be a slip, trip, and fall hazard, especially, let's say, if you have a dark carpet and a darker coated dog, that could be a trip hazard. But things like leashes, dog bowls, dog toys. If you have a dog at home, you probably understand this, but anything can turn into a trip hazard with a dog. And preventing these kinds of trip hazards, you could limit leash lengths. I really dislike flexi leashes, which are shown in this picture. I mean, they're great if you're on a walk in a large environment, or out in the woods, or out in a place where there are not other people. But if you've ever been on like a public running trail or walking trail and you've almost tripped over someone's dog because they can go 20 feet in one direction, they're a hazard. So limiting flexi leash use in the workplace, having dog-free zones, so making sure dogs stay out of entryways or hallways or places where people are going to be passing back and forth, designating areas for water and toys so that they're not becoming a hazard where people are stepping over water, spilled water, tripping on toys. All of that can be hazardous. And so a lot of prevention goes towards reducing this potential hazard. Dog bites dog bites occur all the time. 4.5 million dog bites occur each year in the US. Most of them occur from familiar dogs. And 1 in 5 dog bites become infected, which is much lower than for cat bites, but still a problem. And dogs can transmit lots of diseases from their dog bites, including rabies, MRSA, tetanus. And prevention for this is a lot of prevention for this is making sure that, dogs in a work environment pass an obedience test. Most visitation dog or therapy dog programs require, probably all of them require, an obedience test in order for the dog to become certified as a therapy or visitation dog. And I'll talk about what those certifications often look like. But a lot of this is just preventing dogs with unpredictable behavior or a history of biting from work environments or environments where they're going to be other people. And, just because a dog is friendly with adult humans doesn't mean that dog will be friendly towards children, because the way dogs see children and adults, they see them as 2 different species, because really, if you think about it, they behave very differently. So if you have a 2-year-old and an adult, they're going to smell different, they're going to walk differently, they're going to interact with their environment a lot differently, they're going to interact with the dog a lot differently. So you have to make sure that the dog is well tested for whatever environment it's going to be in. Slobber and shedding fur is a problem with some breeds of dogs. Slobber is more common among some breeds, like Newfies, the Labs, other types of dogs. We had Newfies growing up, so I just remember a lot of slobber. We had one visitation dog in a program I was in who it was a golden retriever, but she was a slobberer, and so her handler always had a cloth or some paper towels to wipe her down after she got a treat or after she got a drink of water, because she would just be really slobbery. And some people are okay with the slobber and some people are really grossed out about it. So you just got to be aware of who you're interacting with and just keep up after the dog in terms of the slobber. Shedding fur, that's more common among double-coated dogs compared to single coats, and frequent brushing can resolve this problem somewhat. I mean, they're still going to shed, but they shed a lot less if you brush them frequently, and especially if you get one of those Furminator brushes that has like the metal in it, and it really gets close to the skin and really gets a lot of the fur out. So in talking about workplace policy considerations, so what should you do in the work environment to ensure that everyone is happy, the dogs are happy, the people are happy? We're going to go through some considerations there. Now, the caveat for this is that if you have a dog to accommodate disabilities, a lot of these things may be illegal. So you can't necessarily tell someone with a service dog how frequently they have to bathe their dog, for example. So when I'm talking about workplace policy considerations, this is mostly for dogs in pet-friendly workplaces or workplaces instituting therapy dog programs, visitation dog programs for employees or client patients, and again, the pet-friendly environments. And a lot of times, in a lot of hospitals and other healthcare institutions have been implementing these programs for a while, and a lot of them will have well-developed policies and procedures. So that's a good resource to look into if you're considering adding pets to the workplace or a visitation program to the workplace. You can often borrow from other people and contact them and see how effective their policies and procedures have been for them. Minimum training standards. So, we think that if you're going to have a pet-friendly workplace, it's best to make sure that the dogs that are coming to work, if you're going to be in a workplace with lots of other people around, if you work alone, less of an issue. But the American Kennel Club's Canine Good Citizen credential is a good credential to use. And I'll go over what's in the test in just a moment. And for visitation dog programs, credentialing through pet partners or a similar organization is a good way to go. So a lot of times, like a hospital system may have one organization that they work through, and they allow dogs that have been certified, for example, through pet partners or Therapy Dogs International. And so on the Canine Good Citizen test, this requires the dog to accept a friendly stranger, sit politely for petting, be groomed without, calmly. So you go up and brush the dog and the dog's fine with it. You may pick up its paw to look at its nails and it's fine with that. Walking on a loose leash, walking through a crowd, sit and down on command, and then staying in place while you walk a short distance away, and then coming when called. Meeting a friendly strange dog on a leash, so you walk up to the dog and the dog may look at the dog and sniff a little, but that's the extent of their interaction. Reacting or not reacting to a distraction, and then supervised separation. So the dog can be okay if you're, out of the room for a short period of time and they're with a friendly person, a friendly stranger. So the Canine Good Citizen test requires that the dog pass these tests. And I believe with the Canine Good Citizen test, you can't use treats, but you can use lots of praise. So during the test itself, you can't use treats. And I believe you cannot use you can use a harness, like a leash harness that goes around their chest, but you can't use a gentle leader or anything similar to that. So a gentle leader is like a leash that goes around their nose, their muzzle, like a horse, like a bridle for a horse. It works very similarly. When I train service dogs, we would use those because they're really effective and the dog can still eat, breathe. People would ask me if it was a muzzle, and I'd say no, the dog could still bite you. It's not going to, but the gentle leader doesn't impede their movement at all. But with the Canine Good Citizen test, I believe it has to be on a flat leash or in a harness. And then pet partners. So you wouldn't want to just use the Canine Good Citizen test and then go take a dog to a nursing home, because, for example, a nursing home environment is going to have way more extreme, potentially, stimulation than just what the Canine Good Citizen test tests. So the pet partners test, this is just one example. This is one part of their test. So clumsy petting is one example. So your dog has to tolerate someone who may not be as gentle. A restraining hug. People love to give hugs to dogs. Dogs don't hug each other. I don't know how much dogs enjoy hugs. You can do a Google search for dogs being hugged and look at their faces, and a lot of them don't look super happy about it. Dogs, but that's something that people are going to do in public. So if you're going to have a visitation dog or a therapy dog, you're going to want your dog to be able to tolerate that. And your dog may love to be hugged. I don't know. I'm just telling you what the research shows. And then in another scenario, the dog should be used to people staggering and gesturing. And this is true if you're around children, or in a skilled nursing environment where you may have people with dementia or people with mobility issues or anything else. Angry yelling, bump from behind, crowded and petted by several people, leaving food in the environment. This can be hard for some dogs to do, but it is something you can teach a dog to do. I know I saw one testing scenario where the distraction was like hot dogs all over the room, and the dog just had to ignore the hot dogs. But that is very important if you're taking a dog to a place where there may be food in people's hands, there may be food on tables, for them to leave it. And then taking a treat gently is also a good thing for a dog to do if they're going to be in that kind of environment. So depending on the workplace, if it's just an office environment with different people, you may want to have the dog be a canine good citizen. You may not think that's necessary. You may. I think it is more important if it's a therapy dog situation or a visitation dog, that it's important for them to be certified through Pet Partners or a similar organization. And this, just gives you a little more reassurance that the dog's going to be well behaved among other dogs. The dog's going to be well behaved among, different people, to maintain a safe environment. So in terms of what should be recommended or considered for health in the work environment, having a record of immunizations to make sure that the dog isn't going to be transmitting things in the workplace to other dogs potentially. If you have a pet-friendly workplace, you want to make sure that the dog's been vaccinated for something like parvo, which is super, super, super contagious. And you wouldn't want the dog transmitting things to other dogs or potentially to the people in the workplace. Flea and tick medication, frequent baths and grooming, especially if someone in the workplace has allergies. Frequent nail trims. This is important, if you have visitation dogs that are going to be greeting, or interacting with older people. Older people may have thinner skin that tears easily, so you want to make sure that their nails are not just trimmed, but also round, not jagged. So a Dremel tool works really well, and you can train a dog to tolerate. Some dogs tolerate a Dremel tool just right off the bat, and they don't care. Some dogs, it's like they're terrified of it. But it's relatively easy to train a dog to tolerate it. It just takes a long time sometimes. It's a lot of counter conditioning. So showing them giving them a treat while showing them the Dremel tool and touching it to each nail, and but it is something that can be done if that's an important consideration. And then it's also really important in a work environment or any environment to leave the dog at home if it shows signs of illness. So that can be diarrhea or vomiting, uncharacteristic lethargy, hot spots or rashes. So some dogs are prone to hot spots that can get infected pretty easily. And also, like, if the dog just doesn't seem into it that day, it's important to think of the ethical considerations related to the dog. And this is true, especially if you're using the dog as part of your practice. So if you're a psychotherapist, you have competing concerns. You want to make sure the dog is there for your client, but you also need to take into consideration the health and well-being of your dog. So it's important to remember to leave the dog at home if it doesn't feel well or if it's acting strange, and also to know when to as the dog gets older, when to age it out of its job if it's a therapy dog. So designating elimination areas is important in a work environment. So making sure that there's a designated space for poop and pee, and to make sure that people are cleaning up poop or anything else that comes out of the dog. And that can be, if the dog has an accident within the workplace, making sure that you have clear policies related to, making sure that the employee knows that they are responsible for any messes that their dogs create. So having a zero tolerance policy in terms of leaving poop uncleaned up outside, because that can be a health hazard and people can step in it, and that's inconsiderate for lots of reasons. And if you're accommodating a dog for a disability, for someone with a disability, then it's, a concession or an accommodation would be to ensure that the person has time to take the dog outside during the day so that they can eliminate. And we've been required to double bag poop sometimes depending on where we are, so that might be a requirement. You may want to have designated trash cans for poop. All of these things are important. And as I mentioned in the zoonotic diseases slide, a lot of things can pass through poop. So making sure that it's cleaned up appropriately and that everyone washes their hands are important things to do. And yeah, so it's important to develop policy and procedures that clearly clearly lay out who's responsible for what. The dog owner is responsible for this, the employer is responsible for that. So employee considerations are, there are lots of them. One of them are fears and phobias. So if you're considering allowing dogs into the environment, or you're going to start a visitation dog program, make sure that you are, confidentially allowing your employees to express to you or to HR or to whatever mechanism you have if they have fears or phobias. In a 2001 survey, 11% of Americans reported fears of dogs, and these fears of dogs can be, debilitating and can be really detrimental to someone's functioning. So you want to make sure that you're taking that into account when you're making any policy or changes in the workplace. Cultural differences are another consideration. Dog ownership is uncommon in some countries. So if you look at statistics on dog ownership, it's much less common in some places than others. I had a friend who was working in Saudi Arabia, and he found there are lots of stray dogs there, and he found a dog, and he created, he kind of adopted her, but he couldn't buy dog food at the store for her because they just don't have dogs as pets in Saudi Arabia. So I think he had to buy cat food. But so taking into consideration these cultural differences is important when introducing dogs into a workplace. Allergies, I've talked about before. So allergies are often something that comes up in terms of accommodating, even if you're accommodating someone with a disability and allowing them to bring their service dog, you may also need to accommodate someone with an allergy and work with that person. So perhaps that they may switch to a different office that's farther away from the person with the service animal, or they may change their work schedule so that they come into contact with the dog less frequently. Provide HEPA filters. So make sure that you're accommodating the person with the allergy and the person with the disability. And this is the same even if you just have a pet-friendly workplace, to take into consideration the needs of people who may have allergies. And if you're going to introduce dogs in the workplace as, for the psychosocial benefits of it, develop some way of measuring that. So see if you can take a pre and post measure. So if before you introduce dogs, have your dog, have your employees take, ask them if they would like to take some kind of survey, and then evaluate what changes in terms of their happiness at work, or some other metric to evaluate the impact of the dogs, and establish a continuous improvement process to address concerns as they come up. We recently just did a survey because on our campus, the local university, they have like 7 therapy dogs or visitation dogs now that work in the buildings with employees. I think they have one in at the counseling center. They have one at the freshman engineering center, because engineering is a stressful major, and it's been very helpful. But we did a survey where we asked employees in those buildings how they felt about the dog being there in terms of benefits and hazards. And there were a couple people who really were not into the dogs being there. Most people were fine with who took the survey, loved the dogs, loved them being there, but there were several people, 2 or 3 people that really didn't like it. So it's important to take into consideration the needs of your employees, and if there's something in particular that they aren't happy about, if it would be then to at least give them the opportunity to let you know. And so soliciting feedback from employees can come in different forms. And obviously this depends on the type of dog. So if you're accommodating for a disability, the employees have much less of a say than if you just have a pet-friendly workplace. And the approaches to this can vary. So you can have an independent or anonymous comment box system. A dog committee is one potentially good way to do it. So you have a group of employees who serve as the dog committee, and the complaints or suggestions or whatever go through them. And you may have someone, on the dog committee who doesn't have a dog. They don't bring a dog to work, and so they represent the people who don't bring dogs to work. And then you have several people who do, or one person who does. And that way they can field these concerns with cooperation from and communication with management or owners or Or you can also do surveys. So there are multiple ways to approach this, but it is important to communicate with the employees. Safety and security considerations. So it's important to develop policies or procedures to reduce the incidence of slips, trips, and falls. That's a typo. And that's, what I talked about earlier in terms of designating areas as dog-free zones. And this is also important for people who may have fears and phobias. So these are areas where you will never see a dog, because that's very important to have, if you've ever known anyone or had a fear or phobia, knowing that there's a safe area where the dog will never be there, or whatever you're afraid of will never be there, is very helpful. So that might be an important thing to implement, and also important for slips, trips, and falls. So this is a dog-free zone. Dog toys, dog treats, dog leashes, stay out of this area. And develop training materials to ensure dog owners are educated on their responsibilities in the work environment. So that's also, just to make everything clear. So if something does come up, you can say, well, here in this policy, we have this. And also, if you do have someone that you're going to be accommodating and allowing them to bring their service dog to work, with their cooperation and communication, you can also use that as an opportunity to educate the other employees on what's appropriate in terms of interacting with a service dog at work. In general, with service dogs, you always ask the owner before you pet them. You may not want to ask to pet them at all. They are doing a job for someone. And maybe in cooperation with the person with the service dog, because obviously you don't want to violate any confidentiality or anything, using it as an opportunity to educate other people in the workplace in terms of what's generally okay and what's not. And then in terms of legal considerations, understanding federal, state, or province and local laws regarding service dogs and accommodations. And again, there's a lot of variability in this. If you're in the United States, the Job Assistance Network is a great resource for this. You can call them and they will answer your question. And if they don't have an answer, they will find it. I've worked with the lawyer who works, one of the lawyers who works there, and she's wonderful. Also, in terms of laws, knowing the identification, vaccination, and leashing for pet dogs. So if you're allowing, your employees to take their pets out to go to the bathroom, make sure that they're complying with the laws in your municipality or in your state or in your province. Establishing clear eligibility criteria for both dogs and their owners to make sure that the dogs that are in the workplace are well behaved, healthy. In that regard, you may want to have, an age requirement. So the dog has to be at least 6 months old to be in the workplace. And that's also important because puppies can also get illnesses from other dogs pretty easily before they're fully vaccinated. So having these policies and procedures is very helpful for both you and the dog owners and the dogs. And then seeking legal counsel is important to review policies and procedures to make sure that you're complying with everything and that you've covered your bases in terms of potential situations that could happen. So things that could happen like dog bites, dog scratches, all of those incidences that could happen. What's your liability? What's the employee's liability? And I know there's a lot of case law in the United States about that, but there's a lot of information that a lawyer could provide. So in terms of dogs in the workplace, there are a lot of benefits. And, I'm a dog owner, and I couldn't see myself at this point in my life ever not having a dog. And so if I could take my dog to work, I think that would be great. Less easy for me as a federal employee, but I could see the potential, I can see all of the benefits. And I think the scientific research will hopefully fill in some gaps in terms of what we know and what we don't know. But I think it's also important to take into consideration the hazards and risks that dogs do bring into the workplace. And being aware of those and accommodating for those and understanding those can make a healthier and happier work environment for both the dogs and the employees and the employers. And so I really appreciate your time today, and I hope this was informative.
Great. At this moment, we'll open up the question and answer portion of the presentation. So to our audience, if you have any questions at this time, please enter them into the question box on the GoToWebinar panel. A few questions that came in, and you might have mentioned a little bit about this. If we wanted to explore the possibility of dogs in our workplace, can you recommend any studies and resources?
Well, and what I was thinking I would do is I have an annotated bibliography I can share, and so I can send that to you, Angie, and you could post that because there isn't a lot of literature on dogs in the workplace, but I can share with you the 5 or 6 studies that do exist.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll
Yeah,
include that in the email,
sure.
follow-up email to the audience.
Great.
Another question, in your experience with dogs in the workplace, what have you seen as the most common hazards or complaints?
Allergies for sure. Yeah, allergies is something that comes up over and over again. And some people just, and another thing that I've seen is also that people just say dogs don't belong in the workplace. Like, no, that dogs are for home.
Mm-hmm.
So those are often the 2 most common things. And so if you're going to, so knowing that ahead of time before you implement something is good. So you can prepare yourself for those situations, those contingencies.
Mm-hmm. And another question that came in, how can you manage limiting the number of dogs within a workplace? Is it better to be first come, first serve, or a rotating schedule, etc.?
That's a good question. I would say rotating schedule. So, because you could create some ill will if it's just based on who spoke up first. But if you can create like, okay, well, you can bring your dog on Monday and you can bring and this group of people can bring their dog on Tuesday, then I think that would probably be the best compromise in terms of, workplace happiness.
Mm-hmm. If an organization wants to try dogs in the workplace, but without coming up with a formal plan or committee, are there any perceived concerns that should be considered first?
I would make sure to run it by your employees first, just to make because people who have, and make sure they can do it anonymously, because people may not want to disclose, for example, if they have, a phobia, just to get a read on the room, so to speak, so to have an idea of how amenable, because it might be that everyone at your workplace is like, great, let's do it. And so in that case, there may be less you have to take into account. But if you find out that someone is terrified of dogs, then you're going to have to go through a different method of introducing them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you come across any information about dogs in the workplace as it pertains to a sterile environment? Like refrigerators,
yeah.
rooms, kitchens?
That's a good question. And a good place to look in terms of this is, I don't know offhand, but looking at hospitals and how they deal with this, because I know that even in places where sterility is, pretty important, like PICUs and other places, they often do have visitation programs, and so looking into their procedures in terms of keeping things as sterile as possible would be a good way to go. Because I know, that's been a roadblock at our local hospital for a while. There was one doctor in particular who was really resistant to allowing dogs to come to the hospital, and I think they were only allowed to go in the lobby. But recently they've allowed dogs onto units. So there's definitely got to be procedures and policies out there. So I'm sure they exist, and they might be pretty easy to find. I just haven't looked into it.
Okay. A lot of your research was done in the U.S., but in regards to legal responsibilities for employers in Canada, do you know if they're obligated to allow support dogs in the workplace?
So I haven't done much looking into this, but in what I have looked into, I get the impression that Canada is more accommodating than the United States legally. So of course, I would absolutely, I'm not a lawyer, I would absolutely check with, there are often advocacy organizations that you can contact for these kinds of issues. So there may be service dog advocacy organizations that can give you the answer. But my inkling is that Canada is more accommodating, but I can't say for sure.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions for now.
Okay.
And is there anything you would like to add following your presentation?
I don't think so. Thank you all for listening, and I hope I was able to give you some useful information.
Great. And thank you so much for your webinar.